One a day? 3 days.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We're refiring, so I'm very excited to see everybody. Hopefully, it will be consistent. Am I good?
You're good.
Thank you. We are going to study this week connected to the portion, but something has to do with the basic understanding of the text that I believe most people don't even pay attention. So my goal is to make sure that you understand how to study the text, and then we'll see what the Rebbe has to say. The Rebbe actually has a lot more to say than what we're going to be able to cover today, but at least it will give us an understanding on one topic. This week we studied two portions, Acharei and Kedoshim. We combined two portions. I want to read you the beginning of the portion and ask you if you can explain me what I need your input. I need you to explain me what the text reads and how it reads. I'm just reading the translation in English from the text. In the Gutnik Chumash, you may find it on page 737. God said to Moshe, are you paying attention?
737 Gutnik.
Yes.
So it's
In the book, I believe it's 252 we're going to study. But before we study, I want to make sure we understand the text. God said to Moshe, after the death of Aaron's two sons, when they came near before God and they died, God said to Moshe, speak to your brother Aaron that he should not come at all times to the Holy of Holies, inside the partition, in front of the lid which is on the ark, so that he should not die. For my presence always appears there with a pillar of cloud, so no one should go there regularly. Can someone explain me what we just read? Go ahead.
Don't go to the Holy of Holies.
Don't go to...
Except, well, ultimately, there's going to be one exception, right? Which is Yom Kippur, right?
The next verse is talking about the exception, which is on Yom Kippur.
Right. Otherwise,
Anyone disagree with Bob? Everybody understand anything differently? No?
It's not just when you want it, there's a specific time.
Specific time, but we didn't read it, right?
Right.
But I have a big problem. The word God spoke to Moshe, I just read to you twice. Here it is. God said to Moshe, after the death of Aaron's sons, right? When they came near before God, they died. God said to Moshe, speak to your brother Aaron.
Okay.
It's in the text. וידבר spoke. וידבר השם אל משה אחרי מות שני בני אהרון בקרבתם בני השם וימותו. ויאמר השם אל משה, Hashem said to Moshe, דבר אל אהרון אחיך, speak to Aaron.
Okay, so I say it twice?
Twice? What's this twice? Did anybody ever pay attention to it? Okay. And this is what I want to talk about today. Actually, it was totally separate talks. I'm giving you a gist of what we're going to get to, and hopefully we'll get even farther than that. But we need to understand the text. God speak to Moshe after the death of Aaron's sons. We don't know what he said to him. Then God speak to Moshe and tells him, say to Aaron not to come into the Holy of Holies except at a given time on Yom Kippur. Is that clear? Did we understand that? So it's a clear, simple text that when you study, you have to pay attention. Again, the word twice God spoke to Moshe in what I just read to you. The first time God spoke to Moshe after Aaron's son died. Torah does not tell us what he said to him. And then God speaks to Moshe and tells him, speak unto Aaron, he shouldn't enter the Holy of Holies unless it's a given time, and we interpret it so you shouldn't die like Aaron's sons entered, right? That's our bridge, so to say, but it's totally separate, two separate talks. Now we can start to see what the Rebbe has to say about this.
So it can be, not to get off subject, but it can be a little confusing if you read it, because
Of course, it's confusing.
obviously, you're trying to get closer to God. That's part of what your life is.
You want to, right?
Yes, you want to. And here God is saying, well, don't get too close.
Exactly. That's going to be the main thrust of our discussion today.
Oh,
actually.
cool.
It's really, the backbone of the whole discussion is about realizing that love for God is very dangerous. It has to be together combined with fear and awe. In other words, there are boundaries, there are restrictions. And the only way I can compare that is to a relationship between husband and wife. People are falling in love at first sight, but they don't realize that there has to be respecting the other person. Otherwise, what happens if I love my spouse without any bounds, without any limitations? She's going to get hurt, she's going to get offended, and I am just expressing my love. Doesn't work like that. That's why in the family, within the couple, in Jewish tradition, there are many, many restrictions. It's not there to restrict, it's actually to connect, but the connection is achieved with the restriction more than the love. And actually, this is exactly what we're going to be speaking about, because it is very peculiar to come and warn Moshe and Aaron to disobey God. That's what he tells them. Moshe tells Aaron, he tells Moshe something. We don't know what he told them. We'll find out what he told them. Then he tells him to tell Aaron not to come so he shouldn't die. And you ask yourself, Aaron is the holiest man. Aaron always follows instructions. What defines Aaron is that he followed exactly the way God said. He didn't do anything out of just desire. And that's why he is Aaron. He was chosen by God, yet he needs those restrictions. In addition, last week, 2 weeks ago, we read that the Torah says Aaron did so as God had commanded him. And Rashi tells us that he did not deviate an iota from God's instructions. In other words, even though it was a great honor, the entire Jewish people are watching him, he did not do a little bit of a change because he knew how careful he has to be. So the last person in the universe to warn against disobeying God should be Aaron. Yet we see that that's a warning. And it comes to remind us that when you're in great love with God or with a human being, because it's a metaphor to human beings as well, the closer you get, the more restrictions you shed off. You let yourself off guard. You let people are yelling at a spouse and they say, oh, because it's my wife. At a stranger, you wouldn't do it because you know they're going to walk away from you. It doesn't work like that. The closer we get to somebody, the less restrictions, the less, so to say, respect we lose. And that's why God picks on the holiest man, the closest, and he gives him a warning. And by the way, I'm getting off on a limb, but I think it's very important. That's why this is, by the way, anybody knows when else we read this portion other than this week? So actually, the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur. This is what we read on Yom Kippur. And one can ask, well, we understand it talks about Yom Kippur, but later on it talks about a very grave misbehaving, the end of the portion that we read on Yom Kippur in the Mincha. And part of the reason is because on Yom Kippur, we get so close to God. It's such a holy moment. One can think that they can let off guard. And that's when the warning is coming. So the whole thing is about, and that's why there is a warning to Moshe first, because Moshe is holier than Aaron. We don't know what the warning, but we can only assume, as we'll discover, if the Rebbe is not talking about it, I've looked into a similar thing. He warns Moshe that the closer he gets, because nobody got close to God like Moshe, make sure you follow the restrictions to the T and the dot, because if you are deviating, I will be extra strict with you more than I would be strict with others. As we know, Moshe was punished just for hitting the rock, so speaking, which is seemingly is so minute, but because he's so close to God, God is much more strict with him. In other words, I'm coming full circle. When you want to have a relationship with God, it's not about how you feel and what makes sense to you. It's about God's orders and God's restrictions. And the same applies to a relationship. I think you wanted to ask something?
The closer we come to Hashem, are we more vulnerable to the Yetzer Hara?
Yes, of course. Now let's see how after sharing you the introduction, I think we'll be able to go a little fast. We'll skip some sections because I want to go into the Kabbalah idea of Aaron's sons, which is very powerful. I'm reading in selections from Likutei Sichos, page 252. Our sages explain that the reason the commandment to Moshe regarding Aaron, he shall not enter the holy place at all times, was prefaced by the phrase, after the death of two sons of Aaron, when they drew close before God and died, was so that he not die like his sons died. Our sages tell us when God tells Moshe, tell Aaron not to enter the Holy of Holies, and he spoke to him immediately after the death of his sons, it's kind of a reminder to him, this is what happens to someone who enters without permission. The mention of the sin committed by his sons who entered the holy place and drew close before God and died was intended to motivate Aaron to obey God's command and be careful to enter the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies only when prescribed. So far, so good. Did you understand that? So God tells Moshe to speak to Aaron after the death of Aaron's sons, and to warn him not to enter the Holy of Holies because their sons enter Holy of Holies without permission. Yes. It says Bekorbatam, when they come close, when they came near to God, they enter Holy of Holies. Yes. And therefore, he should be warned that this is something that there is no playing games. In explanation why the commandment to Aaron, he should not enter the holy place at all times, was issued after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they drew close before God and died, the Or Chaim, by the way, everything I just shared with you is the Or Chaim. Or Chaim is Avraham Chaim Azulai, is a Moroccan sage who lived about 300 years ago. He has commentary to the Torah, and at the first verse of the text, he has 5 questions. We're going to deal, I believe, with 2 or 3 of his questions. He starts with 5 questions. So the Or Chaim offers several interpretations. Among them is that the verse in which Parshat Acharei begins, God spoke to Moshe after the death, when they drew close, is not an introduction to the command that follows, but rather an independent statement, highlighting the unique virtue of the divine service of Aaron's sons, who died when they drew close before God. To quote, this is what the Or Chaim says. In other words, as I told you, it's a totally two separate sayings. God spoke to Moshe after Aaron's sons died, and then God tells Moshe, warn Aaron. They are next to each other is because to serve as an example, what happens to someone who comes close to them. This is what the Or Chaim said. God spoke to Moshe concerning the death to explain that it happened in the following manner through drawing close before God. Because they drew close before the sublime light in their cherished passion for holiness, this closeness resulted in their death in a manner identified with the mystical secret of the kiss of God, as a result of which the righteous die. Or Chaim continues. So what the Or Chaim tells us is that the Aaron's sons died in a way what we call death by kiss, kissing God. They got so close to God that their soul departed their body. Oh, so in other words, it wasn't a punishment but they died because they got too close to God. Or Chaim continues, stating that scripture alludes to the wondrous love these righteous men had for God. Even when they felt that this would result in their death, they did not refrain from coming close and clinging to God with pleasantness, pleasure, amiability, preciousness, and intimate sweetness, to the extent that their souls left their bodies. The Or HaChaim tells us that there is something called death by kiss, when they feel such great pleasure connecting to God, that even though they know it will result of the soul leaving the body, which is a sin, allowing the soul to live, because only God can take the soul, they refrained from stopping it and continued on. This explanation also answers the question, why here the Torah does not mention their sin? Although it is explicitly stated in Parshat Shmini, 3 portions ago, we read why, that they brought a strenuous fire before God. Here it says because they got close to God. It's seemingly a contradiction. They offered before God a strange fire that they were not commanded to bring. This is earlier in the story when they died. But here only states when they drew close before God. This point, the drawing close to God, is in and of itself a virtuous act. In other words, when God says to Aaron to remind him not to get closer, so he shouldn't die like Aaron's sons died, not out of a sin, just because they got too close to God. And God is warning against that. We'll find out if it was a sin or not later. The Rebbe is going to talk about it in great detail. On the surface, their interpretation raises, this interpretation raises a question. Why is the verse and the story to which it alludes mentioned in connection with the command to Aaron, he should not enter the holy place at all times? It is necessary to say that even according to this interpretation, describing the manner in which they died with the kiss of God introduces the commandment mentioned above. He shall not enter the holy place at all time. However, in this context, it is not, as implied by the interpretation cited initially, a warning against sin, but a positively oriented instruction. In other words, Rabbi is saying, based on this interpretation, he's not warning Aaron against committing a sin against God, but warning against coming too close to God. Because Aaron's son died because they got too near, they got close. You don't do that. In other words, don't do too good, don't do too much in a positive, that's also inappropriate. So that's one problem that Rabbi is asking, because if you read about their actual demise, it says that they brought a strange fire, which is a sin. Here, we find a greatness to Aaron's sons, that they got too close to God and they didn't stop it on time, warning Aaron not to come too close. Nevertheless, clarification is still necessary for, I'm here number 254. The interpretation offered by Or HaChaim also requires a clarification. How is this interpretation of when they drew close before God and died, that they drew close before the sublime light in their cherished passion for holiness to the extent that their soul has left their body, is consistent with the straightforward meaning of the narrative of Parshat Shmini? Nadav and Avihu each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and placed incense upon it. They offered before God a strange fire that they were not commanded to bring. The implication is that they performed a deed that they were not commanded to do. That is, they committed a sin, something strange and alien, not in concert with God's will. So that's the second question that Rabbi is asking. I already mentioned that in the Shmini, when the event took place, you read about them committing a sin. Here you suddenly read about something that they got close to God, which is not the same.
Isn't there also the issue that after their death, there's immediate comments about not coming in with alcohol, not having
so that we're not discussing it.
But that also suggests a sin of some kind.
Well, based on this interpretation, they were intoxicated mentally, not physically. In other words, their mind and body did not control their heart's desire. What is someone who is drinking and getting intoxicated? Their mind is shut off. He's not thinking straight, right? So when God is warning against intoxication, according to Kabbalah, it's about coming close to God. There are others. We don't have a secretary, so I have to answer. Can I help you? Can I help you? You can. Okay, so I think she's in the classroom. This one? Yes. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to give you a summary of the next two paragraphs. The Rebbe says that some say that when we read about bringing a strange fire, it's not a sin, it's just a description how they got closer to God. Part of getting closer to God and letting the soul leave their body is because they brought the spices, the incense, before God. In other words, when the Torah describes it, it's not a cause for their punishment, it's just a description of what had happened, and therefore it's not a sin. But the Rebbe says that it still is not the same as we read in this week's portion, where it says that they got close to God, near God, which is totally different than bringing a strange fire that God had not commanded them. Here is the Rebbe's explanation. Number 3, we are page 55. It is possible to explain that the foundation of the interpretation of the Or HaChaim is also reflected in the straightforward understanding of this verse in Parshat Shmini. The Rabbi is saying that, I'm not going to go in because it's too technical. The Rabbi is saying, if you read back, after they died, Moshe tells Aaron, God had already hinted to us that he will be sanctified through people who are very close to him. And therefore, Aaron's son, he says to him, you sons, 2 sons are holier than us, because God chose them to be sanctified, to warn people against coming too close. Anybody is familiar with that story? It's in the text, by the way. Anybody is familiar with its story? Nobody? Are you familiar? Okay. Moshe tells Aaron, God said to us, Bikrovai Kadesh, with those who are close to me, I'll be sanctified. And therefore God chose you sons because they are the holiest. And therefore, it must be that they were very holy and they did not sin. They did not bring a strange fire that God had not commanded them, but God had chosen them regardless of what they did. But, and the Rabbi is going on to another idea about sanctifying the temple itself, which I am going to skip.
So I'm sorry. My Bible, I wonder if it's worded differently, because I understand what you're saying, but the one I read was because I started off in a different religion. So, but it reads like tabernacle.
Yeah, it's a tabernacle.
It's the same thing, because the storyline is the same, like with the fire.
Tabernacle is a English translation to the word Mishkan, which is a house of God, a temporary house of God.
Yeah, because the story is like the same. Okay,
right.
I'm sorry.
We are going to go into a much deeper understanding, and I'm going to share with you that I'm going to give you an introduction, but this is where I wanted to get to. In the temple, the tabernacle, there were 2 altars. Anybody familiar with the 2 altars? One is called the external, and one is called the internal. Anybody knows any details about those 2?
Incense is internal.
The external is made out of rocks and it's filled with dirt, with soil. It was large, and it had a ramp. Okay? It was about 18 feet high, I think. The internal was small, made out of gold. It was about 2 feet by 2 feet, or 1.5 by 1.5, and only used for the incense, the spices. There were 11 or 13 mixture types of spices. They mix together, they grind them, and they place twice a day, a handful, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. It brought a great aroma to the entire building, a tabernacle or holy temple later on. We are not allowed, God makes it clear, we're not allowed to bring a sacrifice, an animal sacrifice, or flour sacrifice, or a oil or wine's libation on the internal altar. It only should be bought on the external. The internal is only there for the spices. The rabbi is going to share with us what was Aaron's son's sin, that they bought an external fire. What is an external fire? They used the spices from the internal altar, and they brought it before God in the Holy of Holies. Says the Rebbe that the external altar, representing the animals, the oil, wine, or flour, represent in the human being, because a tabernacle is a human being, is a tabernacle, represent our faculties, our powers, which represent thought, speech, and action.
We've heard that before.
We've
heard that.
Right. The internal represent desire, the willpower. The willpower is on a totally different level. Aaron's sons were trying to achieve the same goal with their willpower as they were able to do with the action and speech and thought. And that mixing the two was what was wrong. That will explain and answer a lot of questions, why it says that they came near, why it says it was external fire, a strange fire, however you want to interpret it. And I'm going to read it to you. As I'm reading to you, you will be able to understand. I'm reading number 4, page 258. These concepts can be further clarified by first explaining the above cited words of Or Chaim regarding Aaron's sons drawing close before God, which highlight the fundamental the closeness and clinging to God achieved by them. Scripture explicitly states that in addition to drawing close to God, Aaron's sons performed a further action. Nadav, and here is the text. Nadav and Avihu each took his fire pan and placed incense in it, and they offered a strange fire before God. That is, the drawing close to God was associated with the offering of incense. It is logical to assume that these are not two discrete actions, but rather they are one and the same. The intensity of their clinging to God to the extent that their souls left their bodies was expressed through the offerings of incense before God. So offering of incense to God is what is part of the act of coming too close to God, or the soul departed. To explain, several sources elaborate upon the general and fundamental difference between offering sacrifices on the outer altar and the offering of the incense on the inner altar. The purpose of offering sacrifices on the outer altar was to elevate the physical substance of this world to God. This is obvious from the very act of bringing a physical animal or the like, and offering its fat and blood on the altar. Fire would descend from heaven and consume it, and the offering would be included in the fire of God. Thus, the intent of the service of offering sacrifices was that man should relate to material objects in the world outside of him, with the intent of elevating them to God. So that's the outer altar. The outer altar, in the way the text reads, you take an animal, you slaughter the animal first, and you put many parts, the blood, the innards, some parts of the animal on the altar to be consumed. So God, the fire came from heaven, consumes it, and that's how you take an outer and a physical object in the universe and make it holy. By contrast, the incense offering brought on the inner altar was not fundamentally intended to elevate material entities to God. Indeed, we are commanded you should not offer strange incense on it, or a burnt offering, or a meal offering. Neither shall you pour libation on it. In other words, the inner altar was restricted, and it is forbidden to bring libation, animal, or strange incense. Instead, it primarily involved the Kohen entering the inner sanctuary to offer the incense and thereby established a bond with God through kindling the fire of the incense and causing the cloud of smoke from the incense to ascend. The difference between, the difference between these two, I just want to show you another detail. In the inner altar, whenever the Kohen, the high priest, would do it, usually the high priest or any other Kohen assigned, everybody else had to leave the temple. Nobody is allowed to be there when they place that incense on the inner altar. They had to wait for a smoke to fill the smoke, fill the entire area, and that's when he came out and everybody came in. The Levites would do their singing and praising, and the Kohanim would bring slaughter animals and start bringing them on the altar. So when it comes to the outer altar, you can have sacrifice being brought on the outer altar while other animals are being slaughtered, another group of animals are being checked. There is flour libation, there is oil libation, there is all kinds of activities. When it comes to the inner altar, no other activity. Everything has to be quiet. In fact, nobody is allowed to be inside. There has to be only one person doing it by himself without anybody else. The difference between these two offerings are also reflected in man's inner personal divine service. The sacrificial service on the outer altar reflects divine service stemming from the outer dimensions of the heart. Its purpose is to bring about a change in the external aspects of a person, that the person carry out God's will in his actions, speech, and thought, these being the garments of his soul. Just like the outer altar is for physical objects to be connected to God, so is in the human being as a tabernacle. It reflects our connection and devotion of our action, speech, and thought, which are the garments, the outer aspects of our soul, connected to God, dedicated to God, purified, etc. The service of offering incense on the inner altar reflects the inner connection of a person with God, achieved by revealing the inner dimensions of his soul that are inherently bonded with God. The revelation of this inner connection will naturally lead a person to ensure that his soul's garments of thought, speech, and action will be as desired, aligned with God's will. The difference, did you understand so far? Huh? So I told you, it refers to the essence of the soul, which is the willpower. The willpower is not, it can be expressed in the way I speak, the way what I think, or the way I act. The speech, thought, and action are external faculties of the soul. The willpower is internal, it's the essence of the soul. And that refers to with the inner altar. And the Rebbe is going to say one more thing before we're going to keep skipping. This difference is also reflected in the difference between the meaning of the very words korbanot, sacrifices, and ketoret, incense. The word korban shares the same root letter as the word kiruv meaning closeness. That is, a person draws close to God by bringing sacrifices. Nevertheless, it is possible that even though he is drawn close to God, he will remain a separate entity, albeit one who is close to God. Korban, the word sacrifice in Hebrew, how do you say korban? What is korban comes from? From the root word karov. Karov means close by. In other words, korbanot, the purpose of korbanot, of sacrifices, sacrifice is a translation of the word, but in the holy language, every word tells you the essence of what's behind it. The purpose of sacrifice is to come closer to God, to subdue our external faculties to God, so we come closer. Now, coming closer to somebody does not make you united with that person. It's still two entities, but instead of being separate, we share a room, we share a business, we share an idea. So we are close to each other. That's korban. Korban, you come close to God, but it's the external faculties that connect to God. By contrast, ketoret, incense, is called in Hebrew ktoret. What is ktoret? Anybody knows the word ktoret means? It's Aramaic. Ktoret means bonding, tying together. Like kesher in Hebrew, ktoret in Hebrew, which means to unite and be one. By contrast, ktoret has the root letter of katar, the Aramaic word for connection and bond. That's the word in Hebrew. As reflected by the verse, his soul is bonded with his soul. We read about Jonathan and David. Similarly, with regards to the relationship here between Jonathan and David, it is said, if you read in the Bible the story of Jonathan and David, Jonathan is a son of Shaul, Saul. They were brother-in-laws, by the way. But David was hated by Saul. Saul wanted to kill him. Jonathan, the son of Saul, who was there very close with them, and he always helped them to escape. It says, the soul of Jonathan became bonded with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as one loves his own soul. In the same vein, the intent of the incense offering is not only that a person draw close to God through his divine services of thought, speech, and action, but that he bond and attach himself to God. Do you understand that? That's why it's in the inner altar, and it's only for serving for that. Did I go too far? No, right? So again, there are two ways of serving God in the temple. You can bring sacrifices. There are different categories on the external altar, and one can bring incense on the inner altar, which is exclusive just for the incense. What's the difference between the two? The external altar is there for physical objects to connect them to God. In the human being as a tabernacle, it refers to the faculties of the soul, not the soul itself, that are devoted to God, that are dedicated to God, that are utilized to serve God. That's why, how do we call this activity? It's called korban. Korban, sacrifice. The word korban means to come near, closer to God. But it's still there is two separate entities here. We just got closer. The inner altar served only for incense. How do you call incense? Incense is called ktoret. Ktoret in Aramaic means to bond and become one entity. In other words, it's taking the essence of the soul in the human being and connecting my willpower. I want to do whatever God wants me to do. Whatever God don't want me to do, I don't even want to. If it's not kosher, I hate it. In that way, we are bonded with God. In that way, it affects our external faculties because it's the essence of the soul. Now, we don't have the time, but that will explain what they did, which was not a sin, but they got close to God. They wanted to bond with God, but they wanted to bond in a level which is way, way out of this universe. They wanted to be so close to God that they want to refrain from serving God in this physical universe. They wanted their soul to be connected to God. And that's when God is saying to Aaron and to Moshe, I shared with you, there are two separate speaking here, not to do it. It's against God's will. Why? Because there has to be a restriction and respect for God if you want to bond with God. If you want to bond, I'm going to use a metaphor of a spouse. If you want to bond with a spouse, you need to set the boundaries, you need to set the restriction, you need to set the limitations. In that way, it's a true bind, because binding with one another, it's not just about one person, it's about two persons, and it can only be achieved when everyone is on the same page. God turned to Moshe, to Aaron, and says, Aaron's sons were very holy, and therefore they drew much closer than any human being. However, it is inappropriate because it wasn't serving me. It wasn't my idea. And that's why I'm warning Aaron, who is the last person you can think of. However, because he's so close to God, he might think that maybe at a given opportunity, he can bond with God and become one. And that's when God says to him, please make sure you don't do it and realize this is a grave sin. How it helps us in our day-to-day life, as I show with regards to spouses, and more importantly, the way we serve God. There are times we use our brains, our thought, speech, and action to come close to God. Sometimes we question, and we're entitled to research, to search and question and find a reason, etc., for everything we do. However, we need to know that that's external faculties of God. The internal, the essence is to connect our desire to God, and that's what Torah is about, spices, the incense, because that's when we take the essence of the soul and binding it with God, of course, up to a certain limitation where God says, you cannot go any farther, you cannot let go of your soul, you need to be here in this universe to serve me. And we will conclude right here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So
Very good. Very good.
Yes.
So Moshe